The cabin, a monument to Jacob Reed's deliberate isolation, stood not merely at the edge of the wilderness, but at the precipice of a world he'd constructed brick by weathered brick. Each plank, each stone, each nail had been wrestled into place, a testament to his defiance against the clamor of humanity. The wood, dark and gnarled, bore the scars of 100 winters, each ring a silent chronicle of Jacob's own deepening solitude. Inside, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows that mimicked the turmoil within Jacob's soul. He wasn't simply a trapper. He was a recluse, a man haunted by the ghosts of a life left behind. His hands, rough and calloused, bore the map of a life etched in hard labor and harder memories. The flicker of the flames illuminated the deep lines etched into his face, each one a testament to years of battling the elements and the demons within. He wasn't always this way. Once there had been a wife, a child, a life filled with warmth and laughter. But a fever, swift and merciless, had taken them both, leaving Jacob a husk of a man, wandering the wilderness in search of an oblivion that never came. The silence he craved wasn't peaceful. It was a deafening reminder of the voices he'd lost. Tonight the wind howled like a banshee, a mournful symphony that echoed the emptiness within him. The sound of the pained whine, when it finally pierced the storm, was a discordant note, a jarring intrusion into his carefully curated silence. It was a sound that tugged at something deep within him, a flicker of humanity he thought long extinguished. He grabbed his rifle, a Winchester Model 1894, its cold steel a familiar comfort in his hands. It was an extension of himself, a tool of survival, a protector in a world where danger lurked behind every tree. As he stepped outside, the biting wind whipped at his face, stinging his eyes and freezing his breath. The snow, a pristine white blanket, was marred by the dark stain of blood. The wolf lay at the threshold, a creature of myth and legend, reduced to a trembling, wounded animal. Its silver-gray fur, once a proud mantle, was matted and stained, a testament to the brutal struggle it had endured. The wound, a gaping tear in its shoulder, pulsed with dark, viscous blood. Jacob's first instinct was to end its suffering, to put it out of its misery. But the wolf's eyes, those luminous orbs of amber, held him captive. They weren't the eyes of a savage beast. They were the eyes of a being in profound pain, pleading for a mercy he wasn't sure he possessed. He remembered his father's words, spoken long ago. "Even the wild things have a right to life, son." Words he had long forgotten, buried beneath layers of grief and hardened indifference. He hesitated, his mind a battleground of conflicting emotions. The hunter, the survivor, warred with the man he once was, the man who knew compassion. The scent of blood, acrid and metallic, filled his nostrils. He saw the shallow rise and fall of the wolf's chest, the labored breaths that spoke of a life hanging by a thread. He thought of the countless animals he had trapped, their lives extinguished for a few pelts, a few dollars. A wave of shame washed over him, a bitter, corrosive feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He knelt, his worn leather gloves cold against the snow. He touched the wolf's fur, the coarse texture a stark contrast to the warmth that emanated from the wounded creature. "All right," he muttered, his voice hoarse, a rusty instrument after years of disuse. "Let's see what we can do." He wasn't rescuing a wolf. He was rescuing a part of himself, a fragment of humanity he thought he'd lost forever. The act was a defiance against the bleakness that had consumed him, a tentative step back into the world of feeling. Carrying the wolf inside was a struggle, its weight a burden and a reminder of its vulnerability. He laid it by the fire, the warmth a stark contrast to the icy chill of the outside world. He worked with a meticulousness born of years of experience, his hands moving with a practiced precision honed by a lifetime of trapping and skinning. But this was different. He wasn't preparing a pelt, he was mending a life. The bullet, a lead slug, was lodged deep in the wolf's shoulder, a testament to the hunter's cruelty. Jacob's jaw tightened as he realized the wound was fresh, the blood still wet. He imagined the scene, the flash of the rifle, the crack of the shot, the wolf's startled yelp, the desperate flight. A surge of anger, hot and fierce, coursed through him. He cleaned the wound with a mixture of boiled water and herbs, his movements gentle despite the urgency of the situation. He used a pair of rusted forceps to extract the bullet, the metallic clang echoing in the silence of the cabin. The wolf whimpered, a low guttural sound that tore at Jacob's heart. He stitched the wound with gut he'd cured himself, his hands moving with a steady confidence. The wolf lay still, its eyes closed, its breathing shallow but steady. He wrapped the wound with bandages, the white cloth a stark contrast to the dark fur. For days, Jacob nursed the wolf, tending to its wounds, feeding it broth and small pieces of meat. He watched as the animal's breathing grew stronger, its eyes slowly regaining their luster. He named it Shadow for its silent presence, its ability to blend into the darkness of the cabin, and for the way it seemed to reflect the darker corners of his own soul. He spent hours by the fire, watching Shadow, observing its movements, its expressions. He saw the gratitude in its eyes, the quiet trust that slowly blossomed between them. He felt a connection, a bond that transcended the boundaries of species. He began talking to Shadow, telling it stories of his life, of his lost wife and child, of the grief that had consumed him. He spoke of the wilderness, of the animals he had trapped, of the guilt that gnawed at his conscience. He spoke of his loneliness, his isolation, his fear of returning to the world he had left behind. Shadow listened, its eyes fixed on Jacob, its presence a silent comfort. It was as if the wolf understood, as if it carried its own burdens, its own sorrows. The cabin, once a place of solitude, became a sanctuary, a place of healing for both man and beast. Jacob started to feel again, the numbness that had encased his heart slowly melting away. He felt a flicker of hope, a sense of purpose he thought he'd lost forever. He was no longer just a trapper, a recluse. He was a caretaker, a protector, a friend. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Shadow suddenly stood, its ears twitching, its body tense. It walked to the door, its movements slow but deliberate, its eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Jacob frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is it, boy?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. Shadow let out a soft whine, a low, mournful sound, and nudged the door with its nose. It was a silent invitation, a plea for Jacob to follow. Jacob hesitated, his instincts telling him to stay inside, to remain in the safety of the cabin. But something in Shadow's eyes, a sense of urgency, a desperate need, compelled him to follow. He grabbed his coat, his rifle, and a lantern, and stepped out into the biting wind. Shadow led him through the snow, its movements slow but steady, its nose to the ground, following an invisible trail. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing darker and more dense around them. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The wind whispered through the pines, a mournful dirge that echoed the loneliness of the wilderness. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, the sense of isolation more profound. Jacob felt a primal fear, a sense of being watched, of being hunted. He gripped his rifle tighter, his senses heightened, his eyes scanning the darkness. Finally, they reached a small clearing, a circle of snow surrounded by towering pines. The moon, a sliver of silver in the dark sky, cast an eerie glow over the clearing, illuminating a sight that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. There in the center of the clearing was a den, a hollow beneath the roots of an ancient oak. And inside the den, huddled together for warmth, were 3 wolf pups, their eyes barely open, their tiny bodies trembling with cold. Jacob's heart ached as he realized the truth. Shadow hadn't just been fighting for its own life. It had been fighting for its pups, for the continuation of its line. The wound he had tended to, the pain he had eased, was a testament to a mother's love, a fierce protectiveness that transcended Jacob's breath, hitched, the sight of the vulnerable pups a stark contrast to the harsh wilderness surrounding them. He felt a wave of protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield them from the cold, the predators, the cruelty of the world. He understood now, the desperate urgency in Shadow's eyes, the unwavering determination that had driven it through the storm. He carefully scooped up the pups, their tiny bodies surprisingly warm against his calloused hands. They whimpered, their eyes blinking in the dim light of the lantern, their soft fur bristling with fear. He held them close, his heart aching with a tenderness he hadn't felt in decades. Shadow, limping heavily, watched him with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Its eyes, though weary, held a quiet pride, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. Back at the cabin, Jacob transformed a corner into a makeshift den, lining it with soft blankets and hay. The pups, their tiny bodies huddled together, nuzzled against each other, their whimpers a symphony of vulnerability. Shadow, despite its injuries, insisted on staying close, its eyes never leaving its offspring. Jacob became a surrogate father, feeding the pups warm milk from a bottle, cleaning their den, and keeping them warm by the fire. He watched them grow, their eyes opening, their tiny paws gaining strength, their personalities emerging. Luna, the eldest, was bold and curious, always exploring the edges of their makeshift den. Storm, the middle pup, was fiercely protective, a miniature guardian, always watchful of its siblings. Ash, the youngest, was quiet and contemplative, its eyes filled with an ancient wisdom that belied its youth. He spent hours watching them play, their clumsy antics a source of endless amusement. He felt a joy he hadn't experienced since his own child was alive, a warmth that spread through his soul like sunlight after a long winter. Shadow, despite its weakening condition, remained the center of their little family. It would nuzzle the pups, lick their fur, and watch them with a quiet pride. Jacob noticed a sadness in its eyes, a sense of resignation, a knowledge that its time was drawing near. He tried to ignore it, to focus on the joy the pups brought him, but the truth was undeniable. Shadow was fading, its strength ebbing away with each passing day. He knew that the wolf had given its all, had poured every ounce of its remaining energy into protecting its young. He spent his evenings by Shadow's side, talking to it, sharing stories, expressing his gratitude. He told it about the changes it had brought to his life, the way it had rekindled his humanity, the way it had shown him the beauty of connection. He noticed the subtle changes in Shadow's demeanor, the deepening of its gaze, the quiet acceptance of its fate. He understood that Shadow was preparing to leave, to embark on a journey beyond the wilderness, beyond the reach of his care. He felt a profound sense of loss, a grief that was both personal and universal. He was losing not just a wolf, but a friend, a companion, a symbol of redemption. The morning Shadow's time came. The air in the cabin was heavy with a quiet sorrow. Jacob woke to find Shadow lying still, its breathing shallow and labored. The pups, sensing their mother's stillness, were curled up beside it, their tiny bodies pressed against its fur, their whimpers a mournful lament. Jacob knelt beside Shadow, his heart heavy with grief. He gently stroked its fur, the coarse texture a familiar comfort beneath his fingers. He looked into its eyes, those luminous orbs that had held so much pain, so much love, so much wisdom. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could have done more." Shadow lifted its head, its eyes filled with a quiet gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had shared. Then with a soft sigh, it closed its eyes and was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft whimpers of the pups and the crackling of the fire. Jacob sat there for a long time, his tears falling silently onto Shadow's fur, his grief a raw, aching wound. He remembered the day he had found Shadow, wounded and alone, and the transformation that had followed. He thought of the lessons he had learned, the compassion he had rediscovered, the love he had found in the most unlikely of places. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for Shadow's presence in his life, for the way it had shown him the true meaning of connection, the power of love, the beauty of life in its purest form. He gently lifted Shadow's body and carried it outside, laying it in the snow beneath the towering pines. He dug a grave, his hands moving with a reverence born of love and respect. He wrapped Shadow in a blanket, a final act of tenderness, and lowered it into the earth. He stood there for a long time, his gaze fixed on the mound of fresh earth, his heart filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. He knew that Shadow's spirit would live on, in the pups, in the wilderness, in the very essence of his being. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and responsibility. Jacob dedicated himself to raising the pups, pouring all his energy into ensuring their survival. He became their protector, their provider, their teacher. He taught them how to hunt, how to track, how to survive in the harsh wilderness. He watched them grow, their personalities solidifying, their bond with each other and with him deepening. Luna, ever adventurous, was the first to venture beyond the cabin, exploring the surrounding forest with a fearless curiosity. Storm, ever vigilant, remained close to the cabin, guarding its perimeter, protecting its inhabitants. Ash, ever contemplative, spent hours observing the world around him, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. Jacob found himself changing too. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, became a vibrant home, filled with the sounds of life, the playful yips of the pups, the crackling of the fire, the aroma of cooking meat. The wilderness, once a source of survival, became a playground, a place of wonder and discovery, a living testament to the beauty of nature. He began to see the world through the pup's eyes, with a sense of awe and wonder. He rediscovered the joy of simple pleasures, the beauty of a sunrise, the majesty of a snow-covered mountain, the thrill of a successful hunt. But there was still a hole in his heart, a void left by Shadow's absence. He often found himself staring at Shadow's favorite spot by the fire, his mind filled with memories of the wolf's quiet presence, its unwavering loyalty, its profound impact on his life. He missed Shadow's eyes, those luminous orbs that had held so much wisdom, so much love, so much understanding. He missed the way Shadow would listen to his stories, its presence a silent comfort, a non-judgmental confidant. He knew that Shadow's legacy would live on, in the pups, in the changes he had made in his own life, in the way he viewed the world. He knew that Shadow had shown him the true meaning of connection, the power of love, the importance of compassion. He resolved to honor Shadow's memory by living a life worthy of its sacrifice, a life filled with love, compassion, and a deep respect for all living things. The rhythm of life in the cabin settled into a comfortable routine, punctuated by the growth of the pups and Jacob's quiet contemplation. One evening, as the fire danced and cast long shadows across the rough-hewn walls, Jacob was cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with meticulous care. He had taught the pups the importance of respect for the tools of survival, a lesson learned from years of hard experience. As he moved a worn leather pouch, something glinted in the dim light, catching his attention. It was a small, tarnished locket, nestled in the corner where Shadow had often rested. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the delicate engravings on its surface. It was cold to the touch, a relic from a life unknown. With trembling hands, he opened the locket. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, were two photographs. One was of a young woman, her face radiant with a gentle smile, her eyes filled with warmth and affection. The other was of a small child, a toddler with bright, curious eyes, their tiny hand reaching out towards the camera. A wave of realization washed over Jacob, a sudden understanding that made his heart ache. He recognized the woman's eyes, the gentle curve of her smile. They were the eyes he had seen in Shadow, the same warmth, the same unwavering love. He understood now. The locket had belonged to Shadow's previous owner, a woman who had loved the wolf, cared for it, and shared a bond that transcended the boundaries of species. Shadow hadn't just been a wild animal. It had been a companion, a friend, a member of a family. The realization brought a mix of emotions, a profound sadness for the woman who had lost her beloved companion, a deep respect for Shadow's loyalty, and a renewed sense of responsibility toward the pups. He understood that he was not just raising wolves, he was carrying on a legacy, a connection to a life that had been abruptly severed. He held the locket close, feeling the weight of its history, the echo of a love that had spanned years and miles. He imagined Shadow as a pup, playful and mischievous, growing up alongside the child in the photograph. He imagined the woman's voice, gentle and soothing, calling Shadow's name. The discovery of the locket was a turning point. It transformed Shadow from a wounded animal into a being with a past, a history, a life beyond the wilderness. It gave Jacob a deeper understanding of the wolf's loyalty, its unwavering devotion, its profound connection to its human companions. The locket became a constant reminder, a symbol of the responsibility Jacob now carried. He knew he couldn't simply keep the locket. He had to find the woman in the photograph, to return a piece of her past, to share the story of Shadow's final days. He packed his meager belongings, preparing for a journey into the unknown. He didn't know where the woman lived, or even if she was still alive, but he was driven by a sense of purpose, a need to honor Shadow's memory. The pups, sensing his departure, followed him with unwavering loyalty. They were no longer just animals under his care. They were his companions, his protectors, his family. He knew that the journey would be arduous, but he was no longer alone. They set out at dawn, the rising sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Jacob carried the locket in a pouch around his neck, a constant reminder of his mission. He followed the faint trails left by travelers, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of civilization. The journey was a test of endurance, a battle against the elements, a struggle for survival. They faced blizzards, treacherous mountain passes, and the ever-present threat of predators. Jacob taught the pups how to hunt, how to navigate, how to survive in the harshest conditions. He told them stories of Shadow, of its courage, its loyalty, its love. He told them about the woman in the photograph, about the bond between humans and animals, about the importance of compassion and respect. The pups listened, their eyes fixed on him, their ears twitching, their tails wagging. They were learning not just survival skills, but the values that Jacob had come to cherish. As they traveled, Jacob noticed the subtle changes in the pups. Luna, ever adventurous, became a skilled hunter, her movements swift and graceful. Storm, ever vigilant, became a fierce protector, always watchful of danger. Ash, ever contemplative, became a wise observer, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding of the world around him. The journey was not just a physical one, it was a journey of self-discovery. Jacob was no longer the isolated recluse, haunted by the ghosts of his past. He was a man with a purpose, a guardian, a storyteller. He began to see the world with new eyes, appreciating the beauty of the wilderness, the resilience of nature, the strength of connection. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a quiet contentment that came from living a life of purpose. After weeks of travel, they finally reached the outskirts of a small town, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering mountains. The town was quaint and quiet, its streets lined with wooden houses, its air filled with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Jacob approached a weathered general store, the only sign of commerce in the town. He entered, his boots crunching on the wooden floor, his eyes scanning the shelves for supplies. The storekeeper, a grizzled old man with a kind face, looked up from his work. "Can I help you, stranger?" he asked, his voice rough but friendly. Jacob showed him the locket, his voice hesitant. "I'm looking for the woman in this photograph," he said. "I believe she might live around here." The storekeeper's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "That's Clara," he said, his voice soft. "She lives in a cabin a few miles up the valley. She's been searching for her wolf for years." Jacob's heart pounded with anticipation. He had found her. He thanked the storekeeper and left the store, the pups following close behind. They followed a winding path up the valley, the air growing colder, the trees growing denser. Finally, they reached a small clearing, and there, nestled among the pines, was a cabin, its windows glowing with warm light. Jacob approached the cabin, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the weathered wood. The door opened, and a woman stood before him, her face etched with years of sorrow, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. It was the woman in the photograph. "Clara?" Jacob asked, his voice barely a whisper. Her eyes widened, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" Jacob showed her the locket, his hands shaking. "I found this," he said. "It belonged to Shadow." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she reached for the locket. She opened it, her gaze fixed on the photographs, her tears falling silently onto the tarnished metal. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "My Shadow." Jacob told her the story of finding Shadow wounded, of nursing it back to health, of the pups, of Shadow's final days. He told her about Shadow's bravery, its loyalty, its love. Clara listened, her tears flowing freely, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. She had lost her beloved companion, but she had found closure, a sense of peace. She was more than just a wolf, Clara whispered, her voice filled with emotion. She was family. Jacob nodded, his heart heavy with grief and gratitude. He handed her the locket, and she clutched it to her chest, her tears falling silently onto the tarnished metal. The reunion was a bittersweet moment, a confluence of sorrow and solace. Clara's grief was palpable, a raw wound laid bare, yet it was tempered by the knowledge that Shadow had lived a life of purpose, had found a sanctuary in Jacob's care, and had left behind a legacy in its pups. Jacob stayed with Clara for several days, sharing stories of Shadow and the pups, painting a vivid picture of the wolf's final chapter. He described Shadow's quiet strength, its unwavering loyalty, and the gentle wisdom that shone from its eyes. Clara listened intently, her heart aching with loss, yet filled with a profound gratitude for the man who had brought her closure. She shared her own memories of Shadow, of the playful pup that had grown into a loyal companion, of the adventures they had shared in the wilderness, of the bond that had transcended the boundaries of species. She spoke of the day Shadow had disappeared, of the frantic search, of the gnawing fear that had haunted her for years. The pups, sensing the emotional weight of the reunion, remained close to Clara, their presence a silent comfort. They nuzzled against her, their soft fur brushing against her skin, their eyes filled with a gentle understanding. Clara, in turn, embraced them, her tears falling onto their fur, her heart overflowing with love. The cabin, once a place of solitude for Clara, became a haven of shared grief and healing. She and Jacob spent their evenings by the fire, sharing stories, reminiscing about Shadow, and finding solace in each other's company. They spoke of the wilderness, of the delicate balance of nature, of the importance of respecting all living things. Jacob realized that he had found more than just the woman in the photograph. He had found a kindred spirit, a soul who understood the profound connection between humans and animals. He had found a friend. When it was time to leave, Clara insisted that Jacob take one of Shadow's pups. "They are part of her legacy," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "and they deserve to be with you, the man who cared for their mother." Jacob hesitated, his heart torn between gratitude and the desire to leave the pups together. But he understood Clara's sentiment, the deep connection she felt to Shadow's offspring. He chose Ash, the quiet and contemplative pup, whose eyes held a depth of wisdom that reminded him of Shadow. He returned to his cabin, Ash by his side, the other pups remaining with Clara, forming a new bond in the familiar setting of their mother's first home. The journey back was a solitary one, yet Jacob didn't feel alone. Ash, with its silent presence and thoughtful gaze, was a constant reminder of Shadow's enduring legacy. Back in his own cabin, Jacob felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The wilderness, once a symbol of his isolation, had become a testament to connection, a place where life and death intertwined, where love and loss coexisted. He had found a purpose beyond survival, a reason to embrace the world he had once shunned. He continued to live a life of solitude, but it was a solitude enriched by the memories of Shadow, by the bond he had formed with Clara, and by the companionship of Ash. He taught Ash the ways of the wilderness, the skills of survival, the importance of respect for all living things. He often thought of Clara, of the woman who had loved Shadow so deeply, of the bond they had formed in their shared grief. He wrote her letters, sharing stories of Ash, of the changes in the wilderness, of the lessons he had learned from Shadow. He learned to embrace the silence, not as a symbol of loneliness, but as a space for reflection, for contemplation, for connection with the natural world. He found beauty in the simple rhythms of life, in the changing seasons, in the quiet moments of observation. He understood that Shadow's legacy was not just about the pups, or about Clara, or even about himself. It was about the interconnectedness of all living things, the delicate balance of nature, the enduring power of love and compassion. He knew that Shadow's spirit would live on, in the wilderness, in the pups, in the hearts of those who had been touched by its presence. He knew that he had been changed forever, transformed by the wolf that had come to his doorstep, wounded and alone, and had shown him the true meaning of life. Years passed and Jacob grew old, his hair turning white, his face etched with the lines of time. But his eyes, once filled with grief and isolation, now held a gentle warmth, a quiet wisdom, a deep appreciation for the beauty of the world around him. He remained a guardian of the wilderness, a protector of its creatures, a storyteller of its tales. He shared the story of Shadow with those who ventured into the wilderness, reminding them of the power of connection, the importance of compassion, the enduring legacy of a wolf named Shadow. And as he sat by the fire, Ash curled up at his feet, he whispered a silent thank you to the wolf that had changed his life forever, a wolf whose legacy lived on, not just in the wilderness, but in the very essence of his being.